Well, it's time for part 4. In this installment of my series on making a little silicone creature, we're going to be casting a silicone skin into a resin mold. And just to catch you up to speed, if you haven't seen the other installments, in part 1, I sculpted a little creature with some eye forms made of TC808 resin, and then I made this resin mold. And now we're going to cast a skin into that using TC5110F platinum silicone. And that finished skin in the follow-up video to this will be painting that and then applying human hair to that. Now, the first order of business is choosing a silicone for our skin. Now, I want something fairly lifelike, and we're going to be choosing from the BJB 1:1 ratio platinum silicones. And these are all translucent materials that can be used for skins, mold making, and a lot of different applications. On the top, we have the very soft 0020, and then the 5110 and 5110F, which is about a short A5, and then moving up a little bit firmer, we have the 5130 and 5130F, and then of course the 5140 and 5150, which are really firm. And those have their place, but not for this application. Today we're going to be using the 5110F. So that comes in two different speeds. The 5110F is the faster of the two. That's what I'm going to be using for this video. And just to go over the properties on that really quick, the 5110F platinum silicone, of course, it's 1:1 mix ratio, very soft like human skin. And this one, the F formula, has a fast working time of 7 minutes and then about an hour to hour and a half demold at room temperature. And of course, it's low viscosity, so it's easy to pour, high elongation, and most important for this application, it responds to the thickening agent, these SC5001 thixotropic additive. And that's what we need to be able to make this silicone brushable to brush into our resin mold. Now, the first thing we need to do is release our mold, just apply a light spray of the Zip 301 mold release. And a really important detail, Zip 301 does not contain any silicone oil, so be very careful about that. Anytime you're casting silicone, you don't want to use a mold release that contains silicone oil, or you could wind up bonding your skin to your mold surface. Now, I've got two different mixing buckets that I've gotten out here, and I'm labeling these Part A and Part B. And I'm going to dispense my 5110F into those mixing buckets. Obviously, the A goes in the A mixing bucket, and the B goes in the B bucket. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to pre-mix my flesh tone into both of those buckets. And the point of that is, for this process, we've got several different stages. We're going to be mixing this up and brushing it in different stages, and later on, we're going to be patching air bubbles and seaming. So we want to make sure all that silicone is exactly the same color. You don't want to try to match that later on and wind up with certain areas like air bubbles and places where you did seaming work that's a lighter or darker shade. Now, I've mentioned this in previous videos on mixing silicone flesh tones, but I'll say it again, repetition is good where coloration is concerned. So real important to make sure you're coloring to the lightest color of your paint scheme. So if you're matching this to a human subject, always a good idea to match to the inside of the wrist, inside of the arm, someplace that doesn't get a lot of sun, and match to that lightest shade. Now, I'm coloring the silicone using a combination of silicone pigment and flocking. Now, I don't want to get too sidetracked with coloration, so be sure to check the end screen. I'll post some past tutorials that I've done on coloring silicone, so definitely check those out. But the most important thing here is we want to do the same thing to both buckets, to our part A and B, and that way when they're combined, we get a consistent color throughout multiple batches. And you want to make sure you stir up your A and B components separately from time to time, because over time, the denser silicone pigments will settle out and some of the flocking fibers will start to float. So make sure you continually stir these up, especially before measuring out batches of silicone. Now, another detail here is when you're doing this on a large scale, especially on a production scale, it's a good idea to use a gram scale to make sure you know exactly how much pigment and flocking you're adding to both sides. Now, once we have our colors established and prepared in our buckets of A and B, we're now ready to mix up our first batch of silicone. Now you'll notice we sprayed release into our mold first and set that aside. That way the mold has plenty of time to dry and that release agent has plenty of time to outgas. So now we're ready to mix up our 5110F, and of course that's mixed 1-to-1 by weight or volume. And we just need a small batch of this. I'm mixing up about 300 grams, 150 grams of part A and about 150 grams of part B. And then I'm going to be adding the SC5001 thickening agent. Now, this is an important detail because if you don't add the thickening agent, you're going to wind up with a runny silicone that's just going to go all over the mold and pool in the deep areas of the mold. And what we want is we want to use this to create a thick paste that we can brush into the mold and have a skin thickness of roughly about 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch, almost like a reverse brush on mold inside that resin mold. So I'm using the maximum of around 1% of silicone thickener for this. So once I mix this up, I'll have a nice thick paste. And we don't have to worry too much about air entrapment on the surface of the mold, provided we really scrub that silicone into that resin mold surface. Because unlike a brush-on mold where we're working over a clay surface that we're worried about distorting, with a rigid mold, we can really work that into the inside surface. Now, a couple of key points you want to think about when you're brushing in a skin like this. We're going to be brushing this into the 2 different halves of the mold. And on this first layer, we're going to stay away from the seam. We're going to brush that silicone right up to the seam and stop there. And on the eye forms, this is the critical part with this first layer. We're going to brush just a thin layer of silicone into the eye area, and we're going to use that almost like a glue to hold those eye forms, because I didn't make this so the eye forms screw into place. You can actually add hardware if you want and screw these into the mold, but I want to keep this fairly simple for this video and especially for the demolding process. So what I'm doing is I'm brushing this into the eye forms, and then I'm going to snap those little eye forms back into place, because with a mold like this, you can actually feel right where they go, because that corneal bulge on the resin eye forms will go right back where it's supposed to go. And you just feel around, feel when that goes back into place, and you're good to go. So here I'm brushing the silicone all over the inside. I want to take care not to trap air bubbles, especially in the nose and the chin and the lips. And then once I've got a good layer of silicone, I'm ready to pop those eye forms into place. And again, if you've got a good resin mold that aligns with those resin eye forms, they'll just about snap right back into place. And what I'm doing there is just feeling when that corneal bulge lines up with the negative mold, and then we're good to go. Now I'm going to take care not to add any more silicone right around the eyes, because I don't want to accidentally push them out of alignment there. We don't want to wind up with a little cross-eyed creature later on. So what I'm doing here is just going back and applying some of that extra silicone to build up the thickness of the skin in other areas. So around the base of the neck and the top of the head and that sort of thing. And another consideration you want to think about is later on, I'm going to be embedding hair in this, or punching hair into that silicone skin. And for that to work, for the hair punching process to work well, we need a decent thickness of silicone, like again, probably 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch at least, to get that hair to really stick well when we're punching it with a needle. So what I'm doing is all that excess silicone, I'm putting that in the top of the head, and that way I have plenty of thick silicone in which to punch that hair later on. Now again, at this stage, remember, we're not going up on the seam, we're just building it right up to that seam, and then once we get everything established and as bubble-free as possible, then we're going to let that sit and cure for about 20 minutes or so. And we just want it to hit, much like a brush-on mold, we want it to be at a point where you can tap on it and not have it come off on your fingertips. If it's a little sticky, that's okay, but just like with a brush-on mold, you don't want a skin that delaminates. You don't want layers of that coming apart later on. So you want to move ahead with that next layer of skin as soon as it's ready to take more silicone. So here you can see I'm tapping it with my fingernail and checking that, and once it's kind of tacky but not coming off on my finger, then we're ready to move along with the next layer of silicone. So again, now we're ready to mix up more of our 5110F. And I'm going to do about the same size batch of skin material with this, about 150 grams of part A and 150 grams of part B. And once again, we'll be thickening that with the SC5001 thickening agent. So real important, that's why you want to have a couple of buckets with enough silicone measured out, your parts A and B separate, that you can do both the skin as well as have leftover material to do any patching and seaming work later on. So real important, you want to have more than enough material to do both your skin as well as patching and seaming once you demold your part. Now here I'm adding the SC5001 thickening agent. And again, I'm adding the maximum percentage of that so I get a nice thick paste. Now remember, with this formula of silicone, we have about a 7-minute working time at room temperature and about an hour to hour and a half demold. You want to be conscious of that because you want to move quickly and deliberately and make sure everything is done well within the working time of the material. Now, if you need more time, if you're working on a much larger skin, like a body or something like that, then you can switch over to the 5110, just the regular 5110 formula. That formula has about a 30-minute working time and a 4-hour demold, so still relatively fast by silicone standards. Now, what I'm doing on this second layer is I'm deliberately going up on the seam about 1/4 of an inch, just outside the seam area. And the reason for that is later on when I put the two halves of the mold together, I want that seam material to kind of squish out both into and out of the head mold. And that way I don't have any little voids when I go to trim that seam back later on. So I want to deliberately apply silicone to that seam area so when the two halves are compressed, we wind up with plenty of material on the seam area. And you'll see that a little better here when I put these two halves together. You see when those go together, they kind of squish out a little bit, and you see that right there on the seam. You see that little bead of silicone pushing in a little bit. And on a mold like this, really we can only access it with a brush from about the neck down. Now, what we're doing here is kind of counterintuitive. By deliberately putting silicone on the seam, what we're doing is counting on the pressure of the mold to push that into kind of a little bead that you'll see there pushing into the mold. And that allows us to have a nice thick margin of silicone where we have to do our seaming work later. So it's okay that we wind up with a seam there because that gives us more than enough material to trim back. Now, I let the silicone sit once I clamp the mold halves together. I let this sit for about 3 hours. And the reason I let this sit longer before I pour foam inside is foam, when it's poured into fresh silicone, can sometimes collapse because if that silicone's still reacting, sometimes you can get some weird stuff happening with your foam reacting to that fresh silicone, and your foam foams up really nice and then sometimes it collapses. So to avoid that, you want to let that sit for a couple of hours at least before you put your foam in. And if you're working with the 5110, the regular formula, obviously you want to wait even longer than that. But real important, before you pour your foam, make sure your silicone has completely set. And this is just a really small batch of foam. I think I did like 50 grams of the part B and 25 grams of the part A. Now this is about an hour or so later, and now our foam has cured completely and we're ready to demold our little creature head. Now this is where you get to see some of the results of some of my hasty decisions made on this mold when I was making the resin mold. Because I did get a few little air bubbles on the inside of the mold when I made that second half, I used some protolina clay to seal those up, and that protolina clay is what you see there that's transferred to that silicone skin. But overall, we have a nice cast ready to clean it up and start our patching work. Now, for time's sake, I'm going to explain the process of filling an air bubble and how I do the seam work, but we're not going to get too far into that just because for this little creature, I'm going to be applying red hair over it that's going to cover most of that seam area. So most of this for this little creature is not as critical as it would be on, say, like a prop head or a regular head prop or something like that. So first I'm going back with a scalpel and removing the excess silicone. And if you use the method I'm doing here where I just smeared a little bit of silicone to anchor the eyes, you'll wind up with a little thin membrane of silicone over your resin eye forms. And that's usually thin enough you can just pick that away with your fingers, just peel that right off the eye form. But if it's a little bit thicker, sometimes you need to use a razor knife to go in there and carefully cut that away. But at this stage, all we're doing is subtracting any of the extra silicone, removing the seam and any air bubbles, any outies as it were. And now we get to test out our eye forms and see how well that worked, because if everything was done in accordance with the prophecy, we should be able to take some regular little 26 millimeter acrylic eyes and pop those right into that head. And you see that that eye socket is perfect for those little eye forms. And they're already oriented the exact way we need them to be for the final product. And these were just some extra brown eyes I had handy just to test that out. And now ready to clean off any mold release residue from the casting process. Remember that we use Zip 301 mold release in the casting, so now we need to remove any residue on our silicone cast. And to do that, I use acetone, and you can find acetone at most hardware stores, but real important here, I'm also going to take those acrylic eye forms back out because I don't want that acetone clouding those eyes, even though I'm not using them for this sculpture. Make sure you remove your eye forms, because if they're those acrylic eyes, acetone will mess those up. And acetone, of course, is a pretty potent solvent, so you want to make sure you work in a well-ventilated area and wear a respirator if necessary. Again, follow the directions on the can of solvent. If it says to wear a respirator or work in a well-ventilated area, make sure you do that, because acetone is a potent solvent. Also wear gloves, and of course I'm using paper towels because I can just take those and throw those away, appropriately of course, but throw those away later on. And once I've cleaned up my sculpture with acetone, I'm ready to start patching air bubbles and working on that seam. So now we're going to go back to that original batch of silicone where we colored the individual components, the A and B, to the color we needed. So now, again, we can mix up a consistent color that will match that skin, and that is really important, especially when you're working on the seam. The last thing you want is to have a really well-blended seam, but it's the wrong color, which then points out the fact that it's a seam. So here I'm mixing up a small batch. I think I did about 20 or 30 grams of A and 20 or 30 grams of B. And then I'm adding more of the SC 5001 thickening agent. And I typically use dental tools for my patching and seaming because there's a lot of these dental tools like the one I'm using here that have that nice little flat end that's perfect for filling those little air bubbles. And what I'm doing for air bubbles like this is when you patch this, an air bubble like this usually wind up with a slightly shiny spot. And sometimes it's really difficult to get the surrounding silicone to really feather out nicely. So to avoid that having a shiny finish on it, what I do is I take a piece of drop cloth material, a really thin mill drop cloth material, and press that over. And that applies kind of a little bit of a texture and takes away that shine. And then I'm doing the same thing on the rest of the seam. I'm using a dental spatula to build up any areas that need to be filled in, like any little negative bubbles, any air bubbles, so to speak. And then I'm building up that seam a little bit thicker than I need, and then what I'm going to do is use that plastic material the same way. You can use the plastic material to reestablish wrinkles and smooth out areas and get a non-shiny finish. So if you just apply the silicone and let that cure in the open air, you'll wind up with a kind of a gloss effect. So what I'm doing here is just smearing that over that silicone seam, leveling that out. And again, I don't have to be super precise for this because I'll be applying hair to all of these areas. But what I wanted to do here is just smooth everything out, get it nice and level. And then I can use that plastic drop cloth material to help feather it out into the surrounding silicone. And like I said, you can pull on it a little bit, help reestablish little neck wrinkles and things like that, and just press that gently into the silicone. And you can use that as kind of a crude way to sculpt at that point, using your fingers or sculpting tools to adjust the shape of the silicone through that plastic material. Now you can also use plastic material like saran wrap and things like that, but be very careful because some plastics will bond to your silicone. So always test first and make sure you're not using a plastic material that could bond to your silicone, because that will really wreck your world when it comes to seaming like this. And now ready to let this cure for a couple of hours, and then we're ready to move on with the painting step of the process. So be sure to stay tuned for our next video covering painting, and then after that we'll be posting another tutorial on hair work. Now, as always, I'll post links to all of the products I used in the video description, so be sure to check those out. And the end screen will have some important links to videos on coloring silicone, so be sure to check those out as well. Now, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe, and of course, click the bell icon to get notified when I post new content. And as always, thanks for watching.